StudyIQ IAS, आपका सिलेक्शन हमारा मिशन।
नमस्कार। आज से हम एक नई श्रृंखला शुरू कर रहे हैं। आई एम स्टार्टिंग अ न्यू सेशन बिफोर यू इन द कॉन्टेक्स्ट ऑफ एथिक्स एज ए पेपर, द GS4 paper, as also in the context of the essay writing. Now, why is it so? And the topic that you may have seen here is ancient Greek philosophers. What have ancient Greek philosophers to do with essay writing? Yes, they have to do with ethics, because if you understand these famous Greek philosophers, you will understand a lot of concepts. And with understanding those concepts and philosophy, you will be certainly better equipped to write an essay. Apart from that, obviously, for GS4 and for ethics paper, these three philosophers are critical. They started actually all of it, all the ethics part. But how is it different from usual understanding of philosophers? The key here is that these ancient Greek philosophers laid emphasis on virtue ethics. Now, what is virtue ethics? Virtue ethics is basically something which is inherent in human beings. Whereas I will talk about other ethical philosophers or philosophers who talked about ethics, and they will relate to actions, meaning thereby the external part of it. Virtue ethics is internal to human being. What you ought to be, what you are inside, what is very, very fundamental. It has nothing to do with the consequences of your action, as is the case. We will talk about consequentialism. Later on, we will discuss the philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, who talked about the consequence of what you are doing, or philosophers like Immanuel Kant, who talked about deontology, that is duty. Both the consequence and duty are part of the action of a human being that impacts external environment. Whereas virtue ethics is internal to a human being. As we go along, we will try and understand what exactly is meant by virtue ethics. So the idea here is not merely to equip you for the questions that come in GS4, that is the ethics paper, the part A of it, but also to make you understand various concepts and ideas and make you think. Because if you start thinking in the manner in which these philosophers have thought, it will be easy for you to write an essay. If you look at the essay papers that have come in the past few years, a large number of topics that are presented to you are philosophical in nature. Now, you can't prepare a topic, and I have always been against it. What I am saying is, you have to prepare yourself, your understanding, your comprehension, your analytical skills in a manner that you are able to write an essay on any subject. But to equip you for that, it is essential to understand various philosophers. And as you go along understanding the philosophies of these philosophers, you will also start thinking, not exactly on those lines, but you will be certainly more analytical in your approach. In this series of presentations that I'll make before you, today I'll be talking about, as I've listed here, the ancient Greek philosophers. This will be followed by a session on other Greek philosophers, the Epicureans and Stoics. Thereafter, I will look at some of the theologians, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, on how they brought a new understanding of human life. Then thereafter, I will go into the slightly modern age when I'll talk about Immanuel Kant and the consequentialists like J.S. Mill and Jeremy Bentham. This will give you a full flavor of how Western philosophy or Western ethics or understanding of ethics evolved over a period of time. As I've said in my presentation on ethics, ethics is basically the understanding of what is right and what is wrong. How this understanding changed over a period of time, you will get to know through these philosophers. Apart from the Western philosophers, the Western understanding of ethics of what is right and what is wrong, I will also touch upon some Indian philosophers. And they will be starting from Chanakya to Raja Ram Mohan Roy. I will talk about Rabindranath Tagore. I'll talk about Aurobindo Ghosh, the philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar. And then we will try and juxtapose the two. Again, this entire exercise or these presentations that I'll be making before you, the whole idea is, apart from understanding what they said, to create your own understanding, your ability to interpret. This, of course, is the main objective of it, that not only will it prepare you for your ethics paper, it will also help you prepare for the essay paper. Okay, with these words, let's get down to these philosophers. Before we get on to these philosophers, I'd like to mention to you that for understanding either the ethical philosophy of any philosopher or philosophy of that philosopher, you must understand the context in which they were writing there or understanding life. These philosophers were in the 4th and 5th century BC. And hence you have to understand the context. In those days, we did not have countries like we have right here, right, like India or China. What we had were city-states. They were small, so to say, countries, self-governed, and by and large, many of them were democratic in nature. Democratic not in the current sense that we understand that everyone had a right to vote. Of course, slaves did not have a right to vote, but whoever had the right to vote elected their governments. And it is in this context, again, the background was that before these, or at the time these philosophers came in, especially Socrates, there was another school of thought called the Sophists. Sophists you have to understand because you have to juxtapose what Sophists were doing with what Socrates was attempting to do. Because Socrates started a new understanding to ethics and philosophy as a whole. Sophists were very limited in their approach. Their objective was very clear. The objective of Sophists was primarily to teach how to run politics. Sophists. So what they were actually doing was taking classes for the nobility on how to become a good politician. So they were focused on politics. So in this sense, they were very realist. They were trying to explain to this nobility how to run politics. They were equipping them with tools that they could speak well, and hence the tools that they adopted was rhetoric. It was not reason. It was rhetoric. And then other thing that they did was they used to charge for it. So it was their profession. They were not talking about anything inherent, good, bad, or anything of that sort. They were very practical in nature. They found people, they had a profession of teaching these people, and they charged for it. And what they were teaching was nothing very great. What they were teaching was how to run politics. And hence, the approach, as I said, they adopted was not in terms of going into reason or arguments, but rhetoric, stating what needs to be done and appealing more to emotions than reason. The focus was on emotions. How do you I mean, you will be able to relate to what is happening these days also, because a lot of what is being said is rhetoric. You are appealing to the emotions of an individual rather than the reason of the individual. So this was the backdrop in which Sophists were working. Ironically, Socrates, to begin with, was thought of as a sophist. But he was so different from it. We have a slide here. We will try and explain how Socrates was different from these sophists. Okay, so let's look at Socrates first. Now, right in the heading here, I have mentioned dialectic is the source of knowledge. What is dialectic? Dialectic comes from dialogue. So it's not that I know everything and I'll explain this to you and you listen and imbibe what I'm telling you. It's not that. It's a question of a dialogue between two individuals. As we know, Socrates himself did not write too many things, or we don't have any writings of Socrates, so to say. Whatever we know of Socrates is as a consequence of what Plato wrote about him. So in Plato's writing, which Socrates was the teacher and Plato was the taught. And Plato, when he started writing, he writes in the form that Socrates wanted, that a dialogue in which Socrates is a character who's having a dialogue with somebody. Now, dialogue actually means that you do not claim to know the truth. You are not being didactic in saying that this is what it should be. No, it is a discovery. As you communicate, as you discuss, as you have a dialogue, you discover the truth. So you don't claim to know the truth, as in the case of Sophists I was mentioning, that they were also not talking about truth, but they were saying you should do this, you should do that. It was more prescriptive than anything else. Socrates does not prescribe anything. Perhaps the only thing that he prescribes is that you should have a dialogue. You should not claim to know everything. The fact of the matter is that Socrates was very clear in his mind that knowledge can be obtained if you admit that you are ignorant. In fact, knowledge emerges out of ignorance. So let us look some of the aspects that are mentioned here. The method of discourse was debate and dialogue. And debate also was not with a view to prove your point. Debate and dialogue was basically to discover. Basically, keep questioning till you find an answer. And when you raise a question, you seek an answer. Then you raise another question, you seek further answer. It is through questioning. Because if you already know something, then you're not questioning. You already can say, this is what is right and this is what is wrong. Socrates, for the first time, was attempting to question. In fact, this approach of his was being questioned. Because these city-states, people who were in the nobility or people who were in the know of things claimed that they knew everything and everyone had to agree with what they were saying. So there was no debate, there was no discussion. There were already people in positions where they could actually dictate and say, this is what it should be. But Socrates changed this totally and said that no, we have to examine everything. An unexamined life is not worth living. And unless you examine, you will not grow in your knowledge. You will not have an understanding. So you have to examine and question everything. It is the questioning of everything, even the questioning of authority, that led to trouble for Socrates. So he says an unexamined life is not worth living. Then the second point is very important. You know, in those Greek days, there were Greek gods, and it was felt that whatever is being told about them should be taken as, the term may not be appropriately correct, but gospel truth, meaning thereby that is the truth. You don't question it. And here he was questioning religion, or religion as it existed during the Greek days. They were questioning on the basis of reason and logic. That's where the argument went. They asked questions about, does God exist? So if you question the existence of God, you will be called a heretic. And that's what happened then, because he was questioning everything. The third point is extremely important. And that is where virtue ethics is distinct from anything else. Socrates says that no one can teach anybody anything. Knowledge exists within. The job of the teacher is to make him understand what he already knows. So knowledge is inherent in individuals. It is inside. It is not tabula rasa, as later on John Locke calls it. Tabula rasa is clean slate, where a teacher teaches and it gets written on the mental slate of a human being. No, Socrates says it's there. It is inherent in human being. What the teacher has to do is to see how we can see within and understand. And this brings to a very interesting part. Socrates says that if anybody is doing anything wrong, it is not that he wants to do a wrong. He does a wrong because he doesn't have the knowledge that it is wrong. So fundamentally, he believes in the goodness of human beings. He feels that if a tyrant is doing anything wrong, at that point in time, he thinks that he is doing the right. But if he is made aware, and it's not somebody telling him, but he himself becomes aware that what he is doing is wrong, he will actually inherently not do wrong. So human beings, for Socrates, are inherently good and right. It is their ignorance that make him do wrong, and hence the focus on knowledge. How does a human being who has knowledge inside can come to know of that knowledge so that he doesn't do anything wrong? So that's why he says true insights come from within. I'm sorry, it's C-O-N-E, it should be C-O-M-E, come from within. It's not from without. In a large number of cases, as you see in Philosophers, most of the knowledge is coming from outside. Here, whether it's Socrates, whether it's Plato, or whether Aristotle, all of them believe that goodness or there is a potential in human being, it is right in him. It doesn't come from outside. And that is why he say, if an individual acquires knowledge, he becomes virtuous. Virtue is the key for Socrates. Why? Because if you acquire knowledge, you become virtuous, and you become virtuous, you do the right thing. That is what ethics for Socrates is all about. But having said all that, because he lived in a particular city-state, Socrates also believed that you have to obey the authority of the state. This appears to be a bit of a contradiction, because if Socrates is questioning everything, why isn't he questioning the state? It's very difficult to answer that question, because he, in the end, though he disagreed or he was charged with a few crimes, and that crime was questioning the authority. And yet, he says that there has to be unquestioned obedience of the state. He was actually not questioning the authority of the state. He was questioning certain fundamental aspects which were deemed or thought to be correct. So he was questioning religion, he was questioning God, he was questioning everything. The reason was that he wanted to have a rational understanding of what was happening. He did not want to take things as they came to him. He wanted to question them. He wanted everyone else to question them. Now, how was Socrates different from Sophists? I had mentioned to you earlier, Sophists believes in paid teaching. I mentioned to you in the beginning that Sophists who existed at the time of Socrates, because these were two parallel schools of thought that were there, Sophists believed in paid teaching. For Socrates, knowledge was end in itself. There was no question of any money behind it. He taught, actually teaching may not be the right word for him, he made people understand and discover knowledge within themselves without charging any fee. There was no question. Then rhetoric was the approach. Sophists adopted approach of rhetoric. He taught dialectic. Dialectic is basically a dialogue, a discussion between two people where you cannot say that who knows the truth. Both are, through this discussion, discovering the truth. Then Sophists attempted to mold an opinion, meaning thereby that if you had a particular view on an issue, through a rhetoric, I will try and convince you to think otherwise. Socrates was not doing that, because for Socrates, the question of opinion does not arise. He says that every individual is inherently good. He has knowledge inside him, but he has to discover that knowledge. For Socrates, he was helping people to discover knowledge that lay within. And then Sophists favored democracy because their whole existence depended on rhetoric and politics, whereas he was suspicious of Aristotle, of democracy. He was not so much in favor. Later on, we see Plato and Aristotle not so much in favor of democracy. Here, he had doubts about democracy, and that was the difference between the two schools of thought, Sophists and Socrates. Now we come to the pupil of Socrates. Whereas Socrates was a poor man, he was son of a sculptor, and he did not have a great life. But Plato had a good life. He was a nobleman. He was from the noble family. Yet he followed Socrates because he liked the manner in which Socrates approached issues. In fact, when Socrates was condemned to death, the penalty was death penalty. Many of his friends told him to run away, but he refused to run away. He said, no, I will face the consequences of what I am saying, because he believed that you have to live the life that you think you should live, and you should live the life about the manner in which you talk about it. So your talking and your action, there has to be consonance between the two. There can't be a disconnect between what you talk and what you do. So he said that I believe in going by the decisions of the state. He argued that what he was saying was correct, but ultimately he did not run away. He stayed back and suffered the consequences of what he was doing. Now, let us look at Plato. Plato carried forward, and it may not be exactly right to say he was carrying forward. In fact, he wrote about Socrates and he was developing Socrates further. So again, for Plato also, everything was inherent in individual. He also believed in virtue ethics. Ethics did not exist or on the basis of the consequences of your action. Actions had nothing to do with it. It is inherent in you. That is what Socrates said, and that's what Plato also said. Here, I will take you straight to this point first, the four cardinal virtues, and then develop the theory here. Like Socrates, Plato also believed that virtuous life is life of knowledge. It's not money. You have to have knowledge. And knowledge, both for Socrates and Plato, were extremely critical. All the vices in the world were on account of ignorance. And the methodology was very simple, both for Socrates and Plato, that knowledge was within a human being. He has to discover that. You turn light inwards and understand that. But for Socrates, there were four cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. When he talked about these four virtues, he did not look at these virtues in isolation. The reason was very simple. If you possessed only one of these four virtues, then you will not have a successful life, or justice will not be obtained in a society or even an individual. You will not be able to reach the destination that you have to reach as an individual or as a society if only one of the virtues exists. Let me explain this to you. Prudence actually is wisdom. In common parlance, prudence is wisdom, meaning doing something which is considered to be right, which should be prudent, which should be wise. So, for example, Muhammad bin Tughlaq, the emperor, the Indian emperor at that point in time, was a very courageous man actually. He had this fortitude, he had this courage, but he probably did not have the prudence. So he changed the currency without realizing the consequence of it. He changed the capital to disastrous consequences. So he was not prudent. So you have to be wise to take a decision. And that is what Plato said, that you have to possess all these virtues. And the primary virtue for him is justice, which I think is the ultimate objective. Justice will come if every individual does what he is best at. And this takes you to the idea. When he talks of idea, this concept of idea emerged as a consequence of understanding that in this world, many things are changing. But in this changing world, is there something which is not changing, which is the essence of everything? So Plato used the word like horsiness. What is horsiness? You have one horse who is with a black skin, a black hair, a white horse, brown horse, tall horse. But there are some essential qualities of a horse which exist in every horse, every type of horse. Those essential qualities were the idea of horse, which will exist in every variant of the form. So idea is that horsiness, but form takes shape in different shapes and sizes of horses. So that fundamental essence is the idea. And he says that whereas body is transitory, soul is perennial. What is that soul? The essence of anything that is perennial. Similarly, like body, this is a form. Whereas soul is permanent, and the soul exists in every human being. That's what he's saying. Now, what are these features of soul elements? And from these we will derive what he meant by justice. The fundamental understanding of Plato was that every individual has some basic features, some basic qualities. If he acts according to those qualities, then justice will prevail in the society and justice will be there for the individual. And he said there are three sets of qualities in an individual. One is based on reason, the other is courage, and third is appetite. Mind you, Plato is not rejecting sensory natural desires for eating or living with people. He's not negating that. What he's saying is all these are essential for human being, because one has to have appetite to live. One has to have courage. which he talks in terms of fortitude here. And then you have to reason. All these three have to be there. But you have to identify which individual is good for appetite, which is good for courage. So, for example, if a businessman is there, his focus is on appetite. If a soldier is there, the focus there is on courage. And if there is a philosopher king or the leader, then he has to have reason. Even that person may have these other attributes, but the dominant attribute would be reason. That's very important. So he says that every individual has all these three attributes, but one of these attributes is the dominant one. And that is what he says, that if in a society, if the person whose dominant feature is reason is a leader, then that society is an ideal society. Similarly, a person who has courage, that's the dominant feature. It is not to say that he doesn't have reason or he doesn't have appetite. He may have that, but the dominant feature is courage. Then the society will be ideal. That's what he's looking at. So he says that the individual as well as the society should be based on the dominant feature of that individual. And if that happens, it will lead to justice. And if you compare with these cardinal virtues, you will find that when he talks of fortitude, he's talking of courage here. So, whereas it is essential, but it is not sufficient. What is sufficient is, if the dominant feature is reason, then he should lead. So, this was the formulation of Plato. He said that since every individual has these three attributes in him, the job of the society is to determine which of the feature is dominant and assign him that particular responsibility in the running of the government or running of the society. Now, how does that happen? It's very important. In that sense, Plato was a bit of a communist, because he did not say that not to give chance to others. For him, the entire education system that he wanted to put in place was basically to discover who's good at what. Education was to discover who was good at what. And hence, everyone got an opportunity to be educated. That's what he says. And that includes women. They will also get an opportunity to do. And over a period of time, as they pass examinations at various stages of life, they will discover some will go out, will not be able to pass the courage test, so they will fall off. They will remain in this category. Others will have, may not pass the reason test, so they will remain, soldiers. And some will go on to the top, and they will be further trained to become so-called the leaders of the society. So, as he talks of education, the whole idea of education was identifying the categories to which individual belonged, and through training and examination and tests, you will discover which individual is good at what. And that is why he's used education as a tool to determine who is good at what. And once you do that, he feels that there would be justice in the society. Theory of justice is, if what is right for him, what is ethical for him, that if a man of reason is leader, if the man of courage is a soldier, if a man of appetite is a businessman, then there is justice in the society. So is the case in an individual as well. Now, he was also called, he was closer to present day understanding of communism. In fact, he went a step ahead. For him, he said there should be no family. Why? Because he said that on account of family commitments, the individual is not committed to the role that he has to perform. He will be bound by certain obligations towards his wife or towards his children. So he had his theory of communism, that all children will not be kept with their parents, they will be brought up differently to discover where they stand here, and whoever goes up the ladder, he will have no other commitments except the commitment to do what he has to do. That is the duty of each individual. He has to lead, this chap has to be a soldier, and here he has to do business. So that's where it is. And then, during that time, if you imagine, Plato says that even women should go through this education and discover to which level do they belong, and they could even become leaders. So Plato's thought was very revolutionary. But the problem was, as is his book Utopia, it is utopian in the sense that it is very difficult to visualize that such a society could exist. So it was more in the realm of thought and imagination that Plato was doing that. Here again, if you look at it, coming also from Socrates, he said ignorance is the primary cause of evil, and hence he laid a lot of importance of education, of informing people. Then ultimate objective of human existence is what he called the eudaimonium. Happiness may not really describe, it is more closer to summum bonum. It is closer to sense of grace, sense of satisfaction. To him, this can happen only if there is a harmony. And harmony he ties up with justice. Justice is what? Every individual doing what he's supposed to do. And what is he supposed to do? The dominant feature, as I mentioned here, the dominant of these. In that case, eudaimonia will be achieved if every individual does what he is supposed to do. That for him is justice as well. Then, I mentioned earlier, he is not ignoring material pleasure. You know, in some cases, as you would see later on in case of Stoics and others, they say that unless you have a disconnect from physical pleasure, you will not reach the level of happiness that you're thinking of. Plato doesn't say that. Plato says that that's a necessity in human being. And here also, when he says that even you are a person of reason, you could still have an appetite. It's not that you are bereft of appetites, but the dominant feature would be reason. Now, then proportionality opposed to indulgence. Here, as I mentioned in the first slide, what is proportionality? When we say temperance, I mentioned temperance here. Temperance is being proportional. You can't go to extremes. Now, this is developed further by Aristotle when he talked about golden mean. We'll discuss that later on. Then, women in emancipation, I mentioned, he was so, in that sense, he was communist. He wanted equality for women. Then, a very interesting aspect is the allegory of cave. It's very important. He says that as human beings do not have a full vision of what's going on, their knowledge is very limited. How does he explain that? Now here, he explains it through an image that here are people who are bound by ropes here. They do not actually know what is happening outside. They are looking at the images inside. So the images may not be the true reflection of what the reality is. It is only when you get out of that. And that is the job of imparting knowledge, education, that you make these people aware of the reality, not the images. And what is that reality? Reality is understanding the essence of every being. As I mentioned about horsiness, you understand the essence. When you see a variety of horses, you start discovering there is something unique in each horse and which is common to each horse. And that can be discovered only when you actually see the horse. When you are only seeing the image, you will never be able to discover what is the essence of that being. And to understand the essence of that being, you have to be exposed to that being. And when you are exposed to that being, then you start discovering that essence. Here, you will also see some sort of an empiricism coming in. Socrates did not do as much. Gradually, the Greek philosophers from Socrates to Plato are observing and then coming to conclusions. They are not pure thoughts. These thoughts or these abstractions are coming out of the reality that they are seeing. It happens to a greater extent in Aristotle. He sees a greater reality. Plato is still far removed from reality. But he says, for understanding the essence, you have to look at reality. Now we come to Aristotle. He was considered to be the father of philosophy, so to say. Because unlike Plato, here Aristotle actually witnessing something happening. And his abstractions are based on what he witnesses. For him, physical is not ignored, as in case of Plato and Socrates. Physical is not to be ignored. Your abstractions or your understanding or your ideas emanate out of understanding the physical world. So there is no major disconnect between physical and the real. He is real is emerging out of the physical world. It creates problems, but he is more realist in that sense, comparatively speaking, as compared to Plato's Socrates. Now here, he is considered to be the proponent of virtue ethics. As I mentioned earlier in the beginning, it has nothing to do with the consequence of what you do, what are the means and what are the ends, as you see in teleological philosophy or you see in deontology. Later on we'll discuss that it is not, something is not right because you have a duty, something is not right because of the consequences. No, nothing to do. It's fundamental virtue, and this aspect flows from Socrates, flows from Plato, because there are fundamental virtues that he's talking of. Plato spoke about 4 cardinal virtues. Aristotle went to add even more virtues, more larger list of virtues. Like Plato, the ultimate purpose of human being. Now, the purpose is very important. Aristotle says that every being has a potential, and that being moves towards that potential. How does it move towards the potential? So, he says there are 4 fundamental causations. What is this causation? The causation is there is material. For example, there is wood, and then wood gets made into a table, so acquires a form. Wood becomes a table, material becomes a form. So it's a movement from material to form. But for a material to become a form, you require an external intervention to make it, because wood itself may not become. In some cases it may. In this particular case, you require an external intervention. He calls this the efficient causation, meaning thereby that wood gets converted into a table through an intervention of an external agency, and that is But what is the purpose of table? And that's what he means by the ultimate objective of a process. Ultimate purpose of a table is to enable you to write or eat food. That's the purpose of a table. Similarly, for every being, it moves from, because of certain causes, it moves from potential. So wood has the potential to become a table to be used for a particular purpose, but you require an efficient cause, meaning thereby an external intervention for it to be converted from wood into a table. So what he says, what Aristotle says is, self-actualization through eudaimonia is the ultimate objective. And this is beyond material pleasure, because it is inherent in human being. That's the virtue that he's talking of. And this can be worked, as I mentioned earlier, through cultivation of 4 virtues. Now let us try and understand how Aristotle happens to be slightly different from Plato. Whereas Plato was basically considering that these virtues are inherent in human being, and through education, you could make them aware of these virtues that human beings have. What Aristotle says is, you have to take a step beyond pure education. The concerned individual has to get into the habit. He said, and it's a very important aspect, that you have to continuously observe and do that in order to get habituated for cultivation of this virtue. Just education may not help. Once you get habituated, once you do it repeatedly, it becomes an inherent part of you. If it becomes an inherent part of you, then you become virtuous. And that is why he says that. There's another important aspect that he says is the golden mean. We'll discuss it later on, that what exactly does he mean by golden mean. And this comes from something which we talked about Plato, where we talk about temperance. Temperance is avoiding extremes. And here, Aristotle is developing it further, and he also used this word self-control when he says, he uses temperance and elaborates it further and talks about a golden mean. We'll come to that later on. Now, as I have mentioned earlier, virtues, some of it can be imbibed, meaning thereby that if you live in a particular family where no one tells a lie or it's looked down upon, you start imbibing it, because you start feeling it's not right to tell a lie. In a family, if if there are parents who are telling lies, whether at office or at home, or asking you to do things which are wrong, you start imbibing them gradually. He says that you do imbibe, but then beyond that, you can cultivate them as well through habituation. For them, it's very important. Now, this is what he means by, I've just taken one example. There could be any number of examples. So, the mean for courage is one end is courage, at the center is courage, the other end is cowardice, not doing anything. And rashness is not even thinking and jumping into it. So, for example, if you are walking on a street and you find a man beating up an old lady, your first reaction would be somehow save that lady. But if that guy is holding a gun or there are more than one persons, then maybe it will be foolish to go and jump on there. The other alternative is to call the police. So there, courage would mean not merely jumping into it and getting yourself thrashed, but you have to have wisdom to understand that you have to do something, but certainly not rashly. Not doing anything, like just walking past it and let her getting beaten up, would be cowardice. So what Aristotle says, in every situation, you have to understand what is the best possible way, which is the golden mean, not any extreme. And he uses a number of examples to explain what is a virtue and what is vice. So, for example, in case of temperance, and temperance is one of the cardinal virtues which Plato also said, you are totally insensitive, or you become totally self-indulgent. Then modesty is a virtue, but one extreme is shamelessness. You're not bothered about who says what and you do what. And then the other extreme is you're so shy. So Aristotle says that if you can understand this golden mean, and if you can understand this and imbibe them over a period of time or through habituation, you do that. So as I said earlier, Aristotle goes a step ahead beyond Plato and Socrates. For them, it's knowledge that is virtue, if you are made aware. Here, Aristotle says that you have to habituate yourself. So in that sense, Aristotle went a step ahead and said that. So that's what I had to say today. We discussed Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. If you understand these concepts that I mentioned here, it will not only help you in your ethics paper, but certainly it will help you in essay writing as well. It will set you thinking. These philosophers, these thinkers, not only is it good to understand and read them, it helps you think, and that will help you write your essay paper. So thank you very much. We'll meet again in the next session.
StudyIQ IAS, आपका सिलेक्शन हमारा मिशन।